In America's heartland sits Arkansas City, Kansas, a quintessential Midwest town just an hour south of Wichita.
Arkansas City is roughly 12 to 13,000 people. Very nice hometown, beautiful land to be around, great countryside, right in the heart of the Midwest.
It's here that Jennifer Sanderholm grew up and returns for holidays with her parents and two siblings.
My oldest daughter, Jennifer, was pregnant with our first grandchild. We knew it was a little girl, so we were looking forward to that birth in January '07.
Did you find it?
Maybe.
You want me to help you? I actually feel guilty letting you do everything.
No offense, but I don't think you'd fit.
Well, I wouldn't argue there.
With the holidays, our families always got together. Jennifer would come back from Kansas City. Jason was in Wichita going to school. Jody still lived at home.
Found it.
Jody was our youngest. She was a brown-eyed, brown-haired beauty. She was very sweet. She was always there to help people.
It looks pretty.
I think it's great. You know, I got you a present.
Wait, what are you doing? It's not even Christmas yet. You cannot give me a present.
Yes, I can. But
Speaking of you-know-who, and
Oh, sweetie, it's adorable.
she's gonna be a dancer just like me.
I hope she is just like you, or at least can dance like you.
In high school, Jody was on the high school dance line. She was the captain for 2 years, her junior and senior year. When she graduated, she went to Cali College, where she also tried out for the dance line there.
I don't know, I'm really excited.
Also on the dance team with Jody is her best friend since middle school, Lori Leglighter.
I know, I got her the cutest jacket.
Jody was a very upbeat, positive person. We first met in 6th grade. We took dance together, and then our friendship just grew from that point on.
Dance was just her life. She absolutely loved it. She would do it 7 days a week if she could.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 1, 2, 3.
The Cali College dance line was made up of 10 to 12 girls. Jody was choreographing the dance. It was fun to actually stand out and be the center of attention for 3 minutes or so. But I do think that it brought some unwanted attention.
7, 8. Okay, that was awesome. Let's do it again. Lori, can you count us in?
Isn't it a little bit too cold for you to be wearing flip-flops?
I don't care. My feet need to breathe. It's way too hot in there.
Hey, you guys rocked every second out there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Loved your moves.
Thank you.
Jody, you gotta play it up so much. You're drawing a crowd.
Come on, don't start this again.
Just remember, you're mine.
Jody and Owen dated all through high school. I know that she wanted to marry Owen.
Do you want to go grab some food with us? I'm starving.
Nah. Anyway, I'm slammed until I get to Texas. Because if I go, maybe I should stay here and keep an eye on you.
Now you sound crazy.
Owen's brother actually lived in Texas. He would drive back and forth to go visit them. He wanted to move to Texas, and that is one of the reasons Jody wanted to go there to further her education. I actually started crying to her and begged her not to leave me. So it was a very sad moment.
Okay, crazies, I gotta get going. Jody, you coming?
Yes. I'll see you later.
As Owen prepares for a holiday break in Texas, Jody and Lori look forward to some downtime of their own.
After practice, Jody and I walked out together. We were a little bit behind the rest of the girls, so we were the last two to walk out.
All right, well, this is me.
Okay, I had fun today. Love you.
I'll see you later.
Okay.
Love you.
Drive safe.
You too. Text me.
As I was getting in my car, I noticed a car driving by very slowly. And I thought it was odd.
But things get even stranger when Lori pulls out of the parking lot.
Back off, creep. I'm gonna lose this guy. Damn it.
I went down a backcountry road and I noticed that they followed me again. So at that point, I went to the police department and I just sat there because I was like, this person is obviously either trying to scare me or it's just a really big coincidence.
There, in the police department parking lot, Lori debates going in to file a report. But the car has disappeared, so there's no real evidence she was even being stalked.
I sat there for a few more minutes. I didn't see them driving around anymore, so then I just sped home.
Meanwhile, Jody is at home, where she's also feeling a little on edge.
Hello? Hello?
Georgia Bug.
Oh, hey.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to start with you.
It's okay, sorry, I'm just a little jumpy. What's up?
The Cali Tigerettes were performing at a basketball game the next night, and they were performing a dance that she had choreographed. So she was all nervous and stressed.
Don't you look gorgeous?
Thanks. I'm working on a game face. What do you think?
I like it.
Jody and Cindy had a very, very close relationship. They did a lot together. They knew everything about each other. They had a very good mother-daughter relationship.
See, I was wondering if you wanted to have lunch tomorrow.
Oh, you know, I actually have rehearsals early tomorrow. We have the gym midday. Not sure how long it's gonna go for.
Well, if you're not too tired, maybe you want to stop by the shop, have coffee. Jen will be there helping out. Keeps her mind off the waiting.
Yeah, I'll try.
She wanted to cancel lunch. Apparently I was really naive because I thought everything was just fine.
All right. Well, get some sleep, sweetie, okay? And try not to let that glitter get in your eyes.
Okay, Mom.
Love you.
Love you.
Hours before Cowley College Dance Line's big performance, 19-year-old Jody Sanderholm is working hard to make sure the choreography is just right. Unaware that out in the parking lot, something far more sinister is happening.
Even over the Christmas break, they took, I think, maybe like a week off. But as soon as the game started up again, they started having practices during the noon hour. In fact, that was their first practice during break.
Okay, but is it just me or did that go perfectly?
It was so good. I only wish Owen was there to see it, but you know what? He'll see it in person.
Yeah, he probably wants you to do it just for him anyways.
Don't look now, but it looks like you have a couple fans of your own.
The girls and how they dress and everything like that. There was always a following for them I think it's because of their skills and everything like that.
Jody, that's not funny. You know how freaked out I was the other day. I know someone was following me.
But there's always, of course, the backside of that. There's always a following for them for the wrong reason.
It's then that Lori sees the same car that was following her days earlier.
I had mentioned to her, hey, did you see that car? The car's been following me all week.
And when she gets a good look at the driver's face, Lori realizes she knows him.
I told her that I thought that was Justin Thurber. He was around my brother's age, so whenever my brother was hanging around with friends, I had seen him come around once or twice. So I knew what he looked like. He had very distinct facial features. He just always stuck with me.
Jesus, what a freak. Come on. There's something weird about that guy. Did you see
Her
his
response
eyes?
was, that is really
He's
weird. You need to do something about that. Then we kind of just shook it off and went about our day.
Anyways, I really hope we stay this good.
Does lightning strike twice?
Not usually in the same spot.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I'm gonna go shower.
Bye.
She was gonna go take a shower. We were supposed to go meet at her house later that day.
But there in the parking lot, Lori's plans are interrupted by an unwelcome sight.
Oh, no. No.
And I noticed that my tire, it was my rear passenger tire, was completely flat.
What do I do?
At the time, I was not scared. I was angry. I did not call the police. I specifically was just angry that it had happened. I couldn't prove who did it. I could have simply ran over a nail.
Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to startle you.
Who are you?
My name is Jake. Figured I'd come see if you need any help.
All those emotions went through my head, and as I was getting it fixed, I tried to call Jody to tell her about the tire.
I'm gonna call my friend really fast. She's close by, so I think she can help.
Okay.
Hey, Jody, it's me. Something weird might have just happened. Actually, might still be happening. Actually, you know what? I'm okay. Will you just give me a call back? Okay, bye.
The mailbox that Sandra Holmes had was on a dead-end road. As she pulled into the driveway, that he come to the car, forced his way into the car, scared her enough that she felt that she had to comply with his demands at that time.
What are you doing?
Take your jacket off.
Why are you?
Take off your jacket! Give me your hands. Give me your hands.
What are you doing? Why are you doing this?
Shut up! Look at me. Don't move.
Well, I called and she never answered. And that was unlike her because we talked constantly and she always answered phone calls. I called her back again and she still didn't answer.
Why are you doing this?
Shh. Shut up.
Back in the parking lot, a closer look at Lori's tire brings new cause for concern.
And you don't think that I might have just hit something, like sideways?
I think something hit you. You know, I don't want to scare you, but a slash like this usually doesn't happen by accident.
None of it seemed to be threatening until that moment.
You know, I have a daughter. I'd like to think someone would help her if she had a flat.
Thank you so much for helping me. I really do appreciate it.
All that could go through my head was that had to be Justin Thurber. It all kind of clicked through from all the events through the week, and I just had this gut feeling that it was Justin Thurber who slipped my tire. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, what has happened?
But things are far worse than even Lori realizes. After being taken hostage inside her own vehicle, college student Jody Sanderholm has no idea what her captor has planned for her next.
Where are you taking me?
They went south into Oklahoma and then circled back around to the north. I really believe that Jody probably thought that he was just going to take her out for a ride and would then take her back to town.
Please just let me go home. Please, I won't tell anyone, I swear. Just let me go home.
Shut up.
Please. Why won't you talk to me? Please just let me go home. I won't tell anyone, I swear.
Back in Arkansas City, Jody's best friend Lori is looking for Jody after an unsettling ordeal of her own.
Hello? I got my tire repaired and went to Jody's house right after that. When I noticed she wasn't there, I just assumed that she went out to eat with her mom because they were so close.
Oh, look, it's Lori. Hello, Lori.
Hey, Lori.
Hi.
We own a glass company in Ark City. On Friday, Jody was all nervous and stressed because Jody had gone back to practice again for dance line for the Cali Tigerettes. We had made plans for her to come to the glass shop.
Is Jody with you? She said she might come by.
She isn't. I thought she might be here. I've tried to reach her a few times, actually.
You have?
Cindy and I both had determined that we couldn't get a hold of her. It wasn't like her to go anywhere without calling her mom and telling her where she was. So the fact that she wasn't at home and Cindy had no clue where she was just caught me off guard.
Oh. Maybe her phone died. Although that's unusual for her. Jennifer, have you...
Yeah, Mom, I'm trying her now.
My daughter, Jennifer, she was 9 months pregnant, and I know she'd answer Jennifer's phone thinking, okay, you know, we got to drop everything because we're going to have a baby.
But even after multiple attempts, Jennifer doesn't get an answer.
I don't know, it's going to voicemail again.
It clicked in my head that, hey, all of this has been happening all week, that has been abnormal. You've been followed to dance practice. If Justin Thurber knows who you are, he knows who she is. You guys are always together. And so finally I told Cindy.
I was just a nervous wreck. And so I finally couldn't handle it.
I'm calling the police.
And of course, you're watching all these police shows, and they say you have to wait 48 hours. Well, with Ark City being little, the police officers came straight over.
That same night, Arkansas City police meet with the Sanderholm family.
Not really knowing the Sanderholm family prior to that, it still bothered me that there was a child out there that was missing. It seemed like they really knew each other's schedules. The family knew where Jody would drive to go from one place to another. They were very tight, very, very close-knit. very good people.
Let's just walk through this together. In stages, okay?
We filed a missing persons report, and he started questioning, asking us questions and stuff about when was the last time we saw her.
She told them what I had told her about being followed and who I had found out had been following me. From that moment on, that's when the real investigation began.
Is Jody seeing anybody? Does she have a boyfriend?
Yes. For some time now. We like him very much. Owen.
When was the last time you saw him? Have you seen him today?
No, he's in Texas right now.
What about you, Lori? When was the last time you saw him?
After rehearsal, just before break.
Yeah, Jody, gotta play it up so much, you're drawing a crowd.
Come on, don't start this again.
Just remember, you're mine.
We're gonna be looking into all of this. Trust me.
But if Jody's boyfriend is really in Texas, it will take some time to reach him. So in the meantime, detectives focus their efforts on finding Jody.
They haven't been able to find her car, so being cars bigger in person and a whole lot harder to hide, they started looking for the car.
But Jody is already across the state border by now, miles away from anyone who can help her.
Somehow he kept her in his car, whether by force or fear, drove her around, determining what he was going to do, and then ultimately took her into the Call Wildlife area, which is a kind of a wooded area just on the Oklahoma-Kansas border.
Please, why are we here? Please, you don't have to do this. Please. No, please. Please just let me go. Please. Please let me go. No!
Go! 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 Walk!
Jody was very small framed. He could overpower just about anybody.
"19-year-old Jody Sanderholm has been raped and beaten for hours by her abductor. But it's not over yet."
Walk.
Okay.
Walk.
Sometimes in these cases, just the size disparity or just plain fear or the promise that they're going to be okay, sometimes people not necessarily go along with the suspect doing this, but they do just to save their life.
My sister's pregnant.
Walk!
I just want to go home.
Deep in the woods of Call Wildlife area, Jody comes to realize her only escape from this evil man is death. But he won't even grant her that.
He would strangle her to a point to where she would pass out and then allow her to regain somewhat of consciousness. He did that several times.
Look at me. Don't fight me. Do you understand? Do you understand?
It's now been almost 24 hours since Jody first went missing, and her family is starting to panic.
The not knowing what the heck was going on, it's just all a blur, and it was a shock, and your mind just races. I try to sleep, but you don't sleep. You try to eat, you can't eat.
We weren't able to get anything with cell phone information, so we were focusing a lot of efforts on the car itself. The police department had already driven every city street and alleyway in our Kansas City throughout the night and throughout the morning in an attempt to locate her car. They were actually having the deputies drive a lot of the county roads. They had contacted the Kansas Highway Patrol and asked them to bring a plane down to start doing flyovers and searching for the car.
Our Kansas City police know every minute that Jody goes missing puts her at greater risk, so they call upon the Kansas Bureau of Investigation for help.
Jody Sanderholm had been missing since the evening of the 5th. I got contacted on the 6th. Our Kansas City Police Department thoughts were that Jody may have traveled to Texas with her boyfriend, Owen. You start with the bullseye, the immediate family, and kind of work your way out.
Owen, I'm sitting right here in front of you. You're gonna have to look at me in the eye and tell me the truth. You seeing anyone on the side?
What, dude, no, are you kidding me? No, I would never do that to Jody.
Owen had come back from Texas voluntarily. He did not know what was going on with Jody at the time, and it seemed like he was concerned for her.
I am telling you, I haven't seen her in a couple days.
It's not that long a drive. You could have come back for a little bit of a joyride, am I right?
Yeah, but I didn't. And besides, Jody never let me drive her car.
Jody really was particular about her car. She didn't allow anybody to drive it other than herself. At that point, we believe someone got into the car with Jody and abducted her.
Owen, tell me where she is.
I don't know.
Through the investigation, the credit card receipts where he was living at in Texas, and along with cell phone records and everything like that, verified that he was in Texas that day and night.
Detectives now have a solid alibi for the boyfriend, but that only means Jody's in much graver danger than detectives first realized.
I just felt that there was truly something wrong. We had actually come across our first true abduction, and I was hoping at that time that we would be able to gain enough information that we would be doing a rescue for Jody.
Using Jody's cell phone, detectives are soon able to pinpoint where she traveled after disappearing from the school parking lot.
Using cellular telephone technology, we believe that it traveled east of Arkansas City and then went south into Oklahoma and then went out to the Call Wildlife area.
As our Kansas City officers are sent out to investigate the area further, Kansas Bureau of Investigations agents follow up on a tip provided by Jody's friend Lori.
Thurber's in there?
After interviewing Lori that day, she had seen Justin Thurber drive by her as she was leaving the college.
Jesus, what a freak.
And he was actually stopped by law enforcement that day for running a stop sign.
Could this man be the one driving Jody's car that day? Investigators agree it's enough to warrant a closer look. So they bring Justin in for a formal interview.
Mr. Thurber. You know Jody Sanderholm, right?
Yeah, I know who she is.
When was the last time you saw her?
I don't know. Maybe a few days ago.
Her friend said that you honked at her from your truck on campus?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
During the interview with Justin Thurber, his demeanor was somewhat wanting to be helpful. He admitted to being out by the state fishing lake, but he had gone north into a little small town called Dexter. And he said he'd been with some friends and had gotten stuck.
I was out mudding
with some friends. We take our ATVs on back roads, you know, and we got stuck and we split up.
You weren't near the Caw Nature Center, were you?
No, we were under the fishing lake. But my dad picked me up that evening.
Justin's father backed up his alibi as far as going and picking him up near the state lake.
All right, Justin. That's good enough for now. We'll be in touch.
It looks like another dead end. Meanwhile, a search of the Caw Wildlife Area stretches on for more than 72 hours, with little to show for it.
They just sent trackers out there and, just started walking around. They just were searching and searching.
Until finally, on day 4, something catches a tracker's eye.
The only thing I heard him say was, "I have her." Immediately turned to him and asked him what he meant. He states, "I have a female's body covered in wood." He pointed to the direction where it was at. As I walked over towards the body, we knew it was Jody.
Four days after 19-year-old Jody Sanderholm disappeared, our Kansas City police believe their search has come to a devastating end.
When I seen the body there, pretty certain that it was Jody's. Didn't matter whose it was, really, though. I was overcome with so much anger. I investigated a couple homicides prior to that, but nothing like what it appeared had been done. It was evident that she had been struck with something. There were signs of blunt force trauma. There were signs that she was strangulated, and believed that was the cause of death, was strangulation. She was also raped and sodomized.
I worked that crime scene with a couple other detectives and agents throughout that night. Removed each piece of debris and limb one at a time. And we were able to verify that body ended up being that of Jody Sanderholm. Position of her body was similar to what I've studied before in other serial murder type cases that involve some type of sexual assault. We took swabs, of course, off of Jody's body and under her fingernails, and determined that we had a very weak DNA sample. So we sent it to our specialized lab within the KBI.
Meanwhile, Jody's family and friends are forced to face the harsh reality that her young life is over.
My husband and I were just zombies. I mean, everybody's there to help you and talk to you and try to make you feel better, but I don't know, it's just a feeling I wish nobody ever had to feel. I just never realized that anything this evil could happen in our small town.
That same day, 15 minutes away from where Jody's body is found, a second search team makes another key discovery.
We had a dive team come in and dive the fishing lake to see if we could find Jody's car or any other remnants that may have been thrown out there. In seconds, when they got their boat out there, using their sonar device, they were able to find Jody's car down in the water.
The car had been pulled out of the state lake. Of course, it had been submerged in water for 3.5 to 4 days. One of the officers that was assisting our officer with taking care of the car had suggested that they do tape lifts off of the car seats. And that entails taking a piece of adhesive tape and laying it on there and rubbing it and trying to pull off any fibers, hair, or any evidence off that seat. One of the tape lifts revealed one hair out of the driver's seat.
The hair is a big clue, and one that detectives hope will pay off through DNA testing. But in the meantime, the location of the car is enough to bring pause. for detectives realize it's the same place where one suspect claimed to be on the day Jody disappeared.
You weren't near the Caw Nature Center, were you?
No. We were under the fishing lake.
Suddenly, everything about Justin Thurber's story is called into question. So detectives revisit that fateful day in the parking lot.
Jesus, what a freak.
We were able to obtain video footage from about 10 different cameras from the college that I had pulled. And watching that, we see Justin Thurber not only on that day, but other days following different dancers to the college.
It was just eerie to watch. I remember one incident where he had parked in the parking lot, got out of his car, walked over towards the east, and I believe it coincided with the same day that Lori reported that her tire had been flattened.
Finally, investigators are convinced they're closing in on their man, the same man they met with once before, Justin Thurber.
You told me you were with your friends the day Jody disappeared. But your friends said they never saw you that day.
Maybe they just got their days mixed up.
All three of the individuals that Justin said that he was with absolutely denied being with him. I believe there was one statement made that they would not be seen dead with him.
I just got this back from the lab. We found your DNA under Jody's nails and in her car.
I want to talk to a lawyer.
Ultimately, Justin decided not to talk to us anymore, so we were unable to continue questioning because he invoked his right to an attorney. So all of our questioning ceased at that point.
Right.
Still, detectives know they have more than enough to bring this case to trial. In February 2009, Justin Thurber is found guilty of aggravated kidnapping, rape, sodomy, and capital murder in the death of Jody Sanderholm. He is sentenced to death and currently remains on death row.
Justin never admitted his role in the murder of Jody Sanderholm up until the day he went to prison, and I rode with him all the way to prison, and I was the last cop he saw before he went in that cell. You know, a lot of times in these cases we try to answer the why of someone's actions. I really don't know what's going on in Justin Thurber's brain. It's very rare to have a stranger abduction like we did in this case, but I have no doubt that if Justin would have gotten away with this, he would have probably killed again.
For me, it's just something that I will never forget. I can still, to this day, from January 5th to January 12th of 2007, pretty much tell you what I did every hour of the day. The good from it was the fact that it brought the community together. I wouldn't probably know the Sanderholms now as well as I do if it weren't for that one incident. They're some of the strongest people I know.
The night before the trial was to start, Dave Folletti came over to our house and had a confession letter from Justin Thurber saying he would confess to the killing of Jody if we removed the death penalty from the sentencing. We told him no. We said, you made us suffer for 2 years.
In the years since Jody's death, her family has worked hard with legislators to strengthen the laws against stalking, in hopes that something like what happened to their daughter can never happen again.
You hear about them all the time with the actresses and, actors stuff. They get stalked and people breaking into their house. Well, it's real. I mean, it can happen anywhere, so it needs to be stopped. Jody's law was written to make it easier for people that are being stalked to get police protection and help. We had to testify in front of the Senate and House to get it pushed through, and they said that was one of the fastest laws that ever go through the state of Kansas.
Jody was my rock. I miss the fact that she always took care of me. I miss having her as a great friend, I'm sure all of our good friends miss her for the same reasons. She was a very upbeat spirit that always kept you going.
The world lost a very beautiful soul, a really caring and gorgeous girl, a person that would do anything for anybody. But it makes you appreciate who you do have still alive in your life. It makes you hold them closer, makes you communicate and be more open and honest. You never not give a chance to give a hug, say I love you. Just appreciate what you have right now. Never take it for granted.
More than 50 years later, the FBI reopens the case of two missing teenagers. May 2, 1964. A warm afternoon in Mississippi, two 19-year-old black men stood along a rural road, waiting for a ride home. There was nothing remarkable about the moment. No alarm, no sirens, no warning that the next few hours would become one of the darkest chapters in Mississippi's long history of racial violence. Charles Eddie Moore was a college student. Henry Hezekiah Dee had recently graduated from high school and worked at a local lumber mill. They were young. They had families. They had plans. And by the end of that day, both would be gone. For more than 40 years, their disappearance would remain buried beneath layers of silence, fear, failed prosecutions, forgotten evidence, and the passage of time. But the story did not begin with a courtroom. It began beside a road. In the spring of 1964, Mississippi was a state under enormous tension. The civil rights movement was challenging a system that had survived for generations. Black citizens were demanding voting rights. Young activists were organizing. White supremacist groups were watching. The Ku Klux Klan remained active across parts of the state, and rumors about armed black resistance were spreading through communities already poisoned by suspicion. Meadville was a small town. The kind of place where people noticed unfamiliar cars, where people knew one another's families, where a teenager could be recognized simply by the way he dressed. Henry Dee had recently returned from Chicago. He wore a bandana over his hair. According to later court evidence, some Klansmen became suspicious of him. They believed he might be connected to rumors about black people obtaining firearms. Charles Moore had been attending Alcorn College, a historically black institution in Mississippi. His life had been touched by the growing civil rights movement, as had the lives of countless young black Americans of his generation. But on May 2nd, there was no protest march. There was no demonstration. There was only a ride home. Court records later established that members of a local Klan organization noticed Dee and Moore as they traveled together. The teenagers began hitchhiking. A vehicle stopped. That moment would become the dividing line between the lives they had known and the fate that awaited them. The men who picked them up were not offering simple transportation. They were hunting for answers to a conspiracy that existed largely in their own minds. They believed the two young men might know something about weapons allegedly being brought into Franklin County. They believed black militants were preparing for violence. And instead of calling authorities, they chose to take the law into their own hands. The teenagers were driven away. Away from the roadside. Away from witnesses. Away from the ordinary world. They were taken toward the Homachito National Forest. What happened there would eventually become the subject of FBI files, confidential informants, federal indictments, courtroom testimony, and decades of unanswered questions. But in 1964, the first investigation moved through a landscape where fear was often stronger than the law. According to evidence later presented in federal court, James Ford Seal and other Klansmen took control of the teenagers. Seal carried a shotgun. The young men were restrained and interrogated. They were questioned about the supposed movement of weapons and the identity of people believed to be involved in black resistance. The questions became violence. The violence became an attempt to extract information. And when the information they wanted did not appear, the situation became something far worse. The two 19-year-olds were beaten, then transported again. Their captors eventually crossed state lines into Louisiana. That detail would matter decades later, because in 1964, proving a murder committed by members of a violent secret organization was enormously difficult. Witnesses were frightened, local loyalties ran deep, evidence disappeared, memories changed, and some people who knew what had happened chose silence. But the Mississippi River kept its own record. On the night the teenagers disappeared, their families had no idea where they were. There was no immediate explanation. No phone call. No message. No warning. Just absence. For Charles Moore's family, that absence became a permanent wound. His older brother, Thomas Moore, would spend decades carrying the memory of the brother who never came home. Henry D's family faced the same terrible uncertainty. Where were they? What had happened? Who had taken them? And why? In another part of Mississippi, the FBI was already confronting a much larger crisis. The summer of 1964 would become known around the world for the disappearance of three civil rights workers: James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. Their disappearance triggered an enormous federal search. Agents poured into Mississippi. News crews arrived. National attention focused on the three missing men. And then in July, something surfaced from the water. Human remains. At first, investigators believed they might have found the bodies of Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner. The discovery generated immediate urgency. Search teams examined the river. Agents investigated the remains. The nation waited for an answer. But the bodies were not those of the three missing civil rights workers. They belonged to Charles Moore and Henry D., two black teenagers. Two young men who had disappeared weeks earlier. Two victims whose names were suddenly connected to a national investigation that had never been about them. Their bodies had been found almost by accident. And that accident exposed a crime that might otherwise have remained hidden for even longer. The discovery should have transformed the investigation. Instead, the public spotlight moved elsewhere. The disappearance of three civil rights workers had become an international story. The deaths of two black teenagers struggled to receive the same attention. Their families knew the difference. The community knew the difference. And years later, journalists and investigators would ask the question that still hangs over the case. What if those bodies had not been discovered during the search for someone else? How long would Charles Moore and Henry D. have remained missing? How long would their families have waited? How long would the killers have remained free? The investigation produced information. The FBI gathered intelligence. Confidential sources described what had allegedly happened. Names began appearing in reports. James Ford Seal. Charles Marcus Edwards. Other Klansmen. The story slowly emerged from fragments. The teenagers had been taken. They had been beaten. They had been transported. And they had been placed into the Mississippi River. Yet knowing what happened and proving it in court were two completely different things. In November 1964, Seal and Edwards were arrested on state murder charges. It looked like the beginning of justice. But the case did not end with a conviction. The charges were eventually dropped. The investigation lost momentum. The years began to accumulate. 1 year. Then 5. Then 10. Then 20. The witnesses aged. The investigators moved on. The files remained. And the families continued living with the consequences. For Charles Moore's brother, the disappearance never became history. It remained personal. A face. A name. A younger brother who had once walked through the family home and expected to grow old. For Henry D.'s relatives, the wound remained open as well. The river had taken the bodies. Time seemed to take everything else. Evidence. Attention. Public memory. But not the truth. The truth was still somewhere inside the records. Inside old FBI reports. Inside statements made by people who had once been afraid to speak. Inside memories preserved by families. And inside the silence of men who had believed the passage of time would protect them. Decades passed. Then something unexpected happened. A filmmaker looking into the history of Mississippi's civil rights era encountered footage from 1964. The footage showed a body being recovered from a river. It was not the image most people remembered from Mississippi's famous civil rights cases. It belonged to a different story. A story that had been overshadowed. A story involving two 19-year-old men, whose names had almost disappeared from the national memory. The discovery led to a deeper investigation. The filmmaker David Ridgen began examining the case. He met Thomas More. And Thomas More did something that the passage of 40 years had failed to make him stop doing. He kept asking questions. Who killed my brother? Why were they allowed to walk free? Why did the investigation disappear? Why did justice take so long? Those questions were not merely historical. They were accusations against time itself. Because the people responsible had grown old. Some had died. Some had continued living ordinary lives. Some had built families. Some had remained in the same communities. The teenagers had been buried decades earlier. But the men suspected of killing them had been allowed to grow old. That contrast became impossible to ignore. The cold case was no longer simply a file. It became a confrontation between the past and the present. And the FBI was forced to look again. By the early 21st century, the United States government had begun reopening a number of civil rights-era killings. The murders that had once been considered too old to prosecute were being examined under modern federal investigations. The Moore and D case was among them. Old evidence was revisited. Witnesses were reconsidered. Documents were examined. And investigators discovered that time had not destroyed everything. Some witnesses were still alive. Some memories had survived. Some statements carried new significance when viewed alongside evidence collected decades earlier. Then came the moment that changed the case. James Ford Seale was still alive. For years, there had been uncertainty about his whereabouts. Some people believed he was dead. He was not. He was living in Mississippi. The man who had once been investigated for the disappearance of two 19-year-olds had survived long enough to see the case return. In January 2007, federal prosecutors announced that Seale had been indicted. The past had finally reached his front door. The charges were federal kidnapping and conspiracy. The government alleged that Seale and other Klansmen had abducted Moore and D, held them against their will, and transported them across state lines before their deaths. More than 4 decades had passed. The teenagers would have been elderly men if they had survived. Their families had grown old. The investigators from 1964 had retired or died. The country itself had changed. But the indictment sent one unmistakable message. The case was not forgotten. Seale was arrested. The man once believed by some to have escaped justice was now standing before a federal court. The courtroom became the place where 4 decades of evidence would collide. The government presented testimony. Old statements were revisited. The circumstances of the kidnapping were reconstructed. The alleged conspiracy was examined. And the central question was brutally simple. Had James Ford Seale participated in the kidnapping of Charles Moore and Henry D? The defense fought the charges. The passage of time became part of the legal battle. Memories were challenged. Evidence was scrutinized. The government had to prove a crime that had occurred when Lyndon Johnson was president, when the Vietnam War was still escalating, when the civil rights movement was still fighting for basic constitutional rights. But the case survived. In June 2007, after deliberating for only a short time, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. The word landed after 43 years of silence. James Ford Seal was convicted of 2 counts of kidnapping and 1 count of conspiracy. For the families of Charles Moore and Henry D., it was a moment that had seemed impossible for most of their lives. Justice had arrived late. But it had arrived. And yet the case never became simple. Because a conviction does not erase a murder. It does not return a 19-year-old son to his mother. It does not give a brother the chance to grow old beside his sibling. It does not restore the decades stolen from a family. And it does not erase the question of how many other crimes from that era were never prosecuted. The Moore and D case became a symbol of something larger. Not simply murder. Not simply kidnapping. But the extraordinary distance between an American crime and the moment the country was finally willing to confront it. The 2 teenagers had disappeared in 1964. Their bodies had been discovered months later. Their alleged killers had been arrested. The charges had collapsed. The years passed. Then the case returned. And when it returned, it carried every unanswered question with it. Why did justice take 43 years? How many witnesses had died before they could testify? How much evidence had vanished? How many families had spent decades believing that nobody cared? Those questions cannot be answered by a single verdict. The courtroom could determine guilt. It could impose punishment. But it could not reverse history. Charles Moore was still 19 when he died. Henry D. was still 19. Their lives ended before adulthood had truly begun. And that is perhaps the most haunting fact of all. When people speak about cold cases, they often talk about files, boxes, photographs, evidence bags, names typed on aging documents. But a cold case is never really cold to the people left behind. For Thomas Moore, Charles remained his younger brother. For Henry D.'s family, Henry remained the young man who had walked out that day and never returned. The years did not make the loss smaller. They simply made the world more accustomed to living without them. And somewhere in the history of Mississippi, the names Charles Eddie Moore and Henry Hezekiah D. remained attached to a river, a forest, a secret organization, and a crime that refused to disappear. Their story began with 2 teenagers looking for a ride. It ended with a federal conviction more than 4 decades later. Between those 2 moments was an entire lifetime. A lifetime they never received. A lifetime their families spent waiting for answers. And a lifetime in which the evidence remained buried beneath silence, fear, and the belief that some crimes were simply too old to touch. But the files survived. The memories survived. The families survived. And eventually the investigation came back. Not because the past had changed. Because someone finally refused to let the past remain buried. The Mississippi River had carried the evidence away. Time had carried witnesses away. Death had carried some of the suspects away. But the story remained. 2 names. 2 19-year-olds. One terrible afternoon. And a question that took more than 40 years to answer. What happened to Charles Moore and Henry D.? For decades, America knew only that they vanished. Then the river gave them back. And decades after that, a courtroom finally gave their families something the water never could. An answer. More than 50 years later, the FBI reopens the case of 2 missing teenagers. Continuation. But even after the guilty verdict, the story of Charles Moore and Henry D. did not become a story with a clean ending. A courtroom had finally spoken, but the years before that verdict remained filled with questions that no sentence could erase. The conviction had established a measure of accountability, yet it also exposed something far more disturbing. The case had not been impossible to investigate. It had been investigated. Names had been recorded. Statements had been taken. Suspicions had existed almost from the beginning. What had failed was not the existence of information. What had failed was the ability or the willingness to carry that information all the way to justice. That distinction matters. Because when Charles Moore and Henry Dee disappeared in 1964, the machinery of American law did not simply stop working. It moved. Agents searched. Reports were written. Suspects were identified. Arrests were made. But the machinery moved through a society where racial terror could operate openly in some communities, and where witnesses understood the danger of speaking too loudly. The fear was not imaginary. People knew what could happen when someone crossed the wrong line. A person could lose a job. A family could be threatened. A house could be attacked. A witness could suddenly decide that memory was no longer worth discussing. And in that atmosphere, silence could become a form of survival. The Moore and Dee investigation existed inside that silence. The FBI had information suggesting that the young men had been taken by Klansmen. The government eventually had evidence connecting James Ford Seal to the kidnapping. Yet the original prosecution did not produce the justice that Charles and Henry's families needed. Then history moved on. The civil rights movement continued. The Voting Rights Act became law. The political landscape changed. The Vietnam War consumed headlines. Presidents came and went. The generation that had witnessed Mississippi in the 1960s grew older. And the murders of two teenagers became another story buried beneath the enormous history of the American Civil Rights era. But for the families, there was no historical distance. There was only absence. Imagine being 19 years old and knowing that your brother was somewhere in the world but you did not know where. Imagine waiting for a knock on the door. Imagine seeing an unfamiliar car slow down outside your home. Imagine hearing the telephone ring and wondering whether this would finally be the call. Then imagine doing that for months. And then years. And then decades. That is what makes the word cold case so misleading. A case may become cold. Family does not. The grief does not become cold. The questions do not become cold. The photographs do not become cold. They simply become older. Charles Moore's photograph survived. Henry Dee's photograph survived. The faces remained young even as everyone around them aged. There is something uniquely disturbing about photographs from unresolved crimes. The person in the picture never changes. They remain trapped at the exact age they were when history stopped for them. 19. Still young. Still looking toward a future that never arrived. And while their faces remained frozen, the world around them changed almost beyond recognition. Cars changed. Cities changed. Technology changed. The FBI changed. The country changed. But those two faces stayed exactly the same. The case eventually became part of a larger effort to confront unsolved civil rights era crimes. Federal authorities began examining cases that had once been closed, abandoned, or left without successful prosecution. New technology offered opportunities to preserve and analyze evidence. More importantly, old witnesses sometimes became willing to speak. Why? Because the fear that had controlled their lives was finally weakening. The people they had feared were growing old. Some were dead. The political environment had changed. The country was increasingly willing to confront the history it had once tried to bury. And investigators understood something crucial. They did not necessarily need new evidence. Sometimes they needed to look at old evidence differently. A statement made in 1964 might seem incomplete when viewed alone. But place it beside another statement. Then another. Then an FBI report. Then a witness account. Then a timeline. Suddenly, fragments could begin forming a picture. That is the slow violence of time in a criminal investigation. It destroys evidence. But it can also weaken the structures that once protected criminals. A person who remains silent at 30 may speak at 70. A person who was terrified of retaliation at 40 may decide at 80 that there is little left to lose. And a document that once seemed insignificant may become crucial when investigators understand the larger pattern. The Moore D case demonstrated that painfully. The investigation that eventually returned to Seal was not born from a single dramatic clue. It emerged from persistence, from records, from witnesses, from historical research, from the refusal to accept that the passage of time automatically erased responsibility. And that is where the story becomes larger than the two teenagers. Because Charles Moore and Henry D. were not isolated victims of random violence. Their deaths occurred during one of the most dangerous periods in modern American history. Mississippi was at the center of a national struggle over race, power, voting, and citizenship. Black communities were demanding rights that should never have required a struggle to obtain. White supremacists viewed that movement as an existential threat. The Klan and other extremist organizations attempted to intimidate activists and communities through violence. And in that environment, young black men could become targets simply because somebody believed they represented a threat. That belief did not need to be true. It only needed to be believed. Henry D. became a target because of suspicions surrounding weapons. Charles Moore became a victim because he happened to be with him. That detail makes the case especially haunting. There was no evidence that the teenagers had committed the crime their captors imagined. They did not need to have. The accusation itself was enough. And once the men who seized them decided that they had authority, the boundary between interrogation and execution disappeared. The forest became a place where the normal rules no longer applied. The river became a grave. And the families were left behind. Decades later, when prosecutors brought the case back into federal court, they faced a challenge that went far beyond proving a crime. They had to reconstruct a world that no longer existed. The roads were different. The communities were different. People who had been young witnesses were now elderly. Some locations had changed. Some memories had faded. But certain details remained. Names. Baiklas. Meetings. Conversations. And most importantly, the pattern of conduct surrounding the abduction. The government argued that Seal had participated in a coordinated act of violence. The defense challenged the evidence. The jury listened. And then came the verdict. Guilty. For the first time in more than 4 decades, the name of one of the men accused in the deaths of Charles Moore and Henry D. was attached to a federal conviction. But the conviction also raised another uncomfortable question. If justice could finally reach one man after 43 years, what about the others? What happened to everyone else who knew? What happened to the people who helped? What happened to witnesses who remained silent? What happened to other victims whose cases had never been reopened? The answers are harder. Some suspects had died. Some witnesses had disappeared. Some evidence had vanished. And some stories may never be reconstructed completely. That is the cruel mathematics of historical crime. Every year that passes removes something. A witness. A document. A memory. A physical location. Person who knew what happened. Time is not neutral. Time favors disappearance. And sometimes time favors the people who committed the crime. That is why the reopening of old cases matters. Not because every case can be solved. Many cannot. Not because every suspect can be prosecuted. Many are already beyond the reach of the courts. But because reopening a case sends a different message. It says that the victim's life still matters. It says that a crime does not become less serious simply because the calendar advances. And it says that the absence of justice in 1964 does not necessarily mean the absence of justice forever. For the families of Charles and Henry, that distinction was enormous. The verdict could not change what happened. But it could change how history remembered it. Before the investigation was revived, the teenagers risked becoming footnotes. 2 names attached to an old FBI file. 2 bodies discovered during a search for someone else. 2 victims swallowed by the larger story of Mississippi's civil rights struggle. After the case returned, their names became central. Charles Eddie Moore. Henry Hezekiah D. Not numbers. Not evidence. Not anonymous bodies. 2 young men. 2 families. 2 futures stolen. And the more investigators reconstructed the case, the more disturbing the original disappearance became. There had been no mysterious supernatural force. No unexplained vanishing. No impossible crime. There had been men. Decisions. Baiklas. A forest. A river. And silence. The mystery was never really how 2 teenagers could disappear. The mystery was how the people responsible could remain free for so long. That is the question that continues to echo beyond the courtroom. How does a crime survive 40 years? It survives when witnesses are afraid. It survives when institutions fail. It survives when communities choose silence. It survives when the victims are forgotten. And sometimes it survives because the people who know the truth understand that time may be their greatest ally. But time can work in both directions. It can erase. Or it can expose. In the case of Charles Moore and Henry D., the years eventually exposed what decades of silence had hidden. The investigation became a bridge between 2 Americas. The Mississippi of 1964. And the Mississippi of the 21st century. On one side stood a world where racial violence could be carried out under the cover of darkness and intimidation. On the other stood federal prosecutors willing to reopen a case that many people had assumed was beyond reach. Between them stood 43 years. 43 years of unanswered questions. 43 years in which Charles and Henry remained 19 forever. And perhaps that is the image that should remain when the headlines fade. Not the courtroom. Not the defendant. Not the legal arguments. The 2 young men. Walking into a day they believed was ordinary. Waiting for transportation. Expecting to return home. Never knowing that the next few hours would become the final hours of their lives. They could not know the future. They could not know that their disappearance would eventually become part of a federal investigation. They could not know that journalists would one day search for their story. They could not know that their families would wait through decades of uncertainty. And they certainly could not know that one day, more than 4 decades later, their names would return to a courtroom. But history remembered. The FBI remembered. The files remembered. And eventually the country was forced to remember too. The river had been silent. The witnesses had been silent. The years had been silent. But silence is not the same thing as disappearance. Sometimes the truth remains beneath the surface. Waiting. And when the right person begins asking questions, when an old file is reopened, when an investigator reads a forgotten statement one more time, when a family refuses to stop searching, the silence can begin to crack. That is what happened here. Not quickly. Not cleanly. Not without loss. But eventually. The names Charles Moore and Henry D. emerged from the shadows. And once they were spoken again, they could no longer be treated as forgotten victims of a forgotten time. They were 19. They had families. They had futures. And they deserved to come home. They never did. But decades later, the country finally began telling the truth about why. More than 50 years later, the FBI reopens the case of 2 missing teenagers. The verdict did not end the story. It only proved that the past could still reach into the present. James Ford Seal had been convicted in 2007, more than 4 decades after Charles Moore and Henry D. disappeared. But the legal battle did not stop when the jury returned its decision. Seal challenged the conviction. He argued that the federal prosecution had come too late. The case moved upward through the courts, forcing judges to confront a question that seemed almost impossible when viewed from the beginning. Could a crime committed in Mississippi in 1964 still be prosecuted under federal kidnapping law in the 21st century? That question transformed the case once again. This was no longer only about what happened beside a rural Mississippi road. It was about whether time itself could become a shield. Seal's lawyers argued that the prosecution was barred by the statute of limitations. The government disagreed. The legal fight reached the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, where the court examined the unusual history of the case and the federal kidnapping statutes involved. In 2009, the full court rejected Seal's challenge to the limitations issue. The legal process continued, and in 2010 the Fifth Circuit ultimately affirmed his conviction. For investigators, that decision mattered. For the families, it meant something much more personal. The conviction would stand. But behind the legal language was a human story that remained almost unbearable. 2 teenagers had disappeared. Their bodies had been found in the Mississippi River. And the man convicted in connection with their kidnapping would spend the rest of his life in prison. 3 life terms. A sentence arriving more than 40 years after the victims had died. It is difficult to imagine a greater distance between crime and punishment. In 1964, Charles Moore and Henry D. were young men. In 2007, the defendant was an elderly man. The country itself was almost unrecognizable. The people who had watched the teenagers disappear had become old. Some were gone. The world that had surrounded the crime had vanished. And yet the federal government was still asking the same question. Who was responsible? The answer was no longer merely hidden in rumor. A jury had spoken. The courts had reviewed the conviction. The evidence had survived scrutiny. And one of the men connected to the crime had finally been held accountable. But the deeper investigation revealed something even more disturbing. The case had not been forgotten because there was no evidence. It had been forgotten because history had moved forward before justice could catch up. In 1964, the FBI was already dealing with a Mississippi landscape dominated by racial violence and fear. The disappearance of Moore and D. occurred only weeks before the murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner would command national attention. The bodies of Moore and D. were actually discovered during the search for those 3 civil rights workers. The FBI later described the sequence bluntly. Investigators searching for Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman found the decomposed bodies of Moore and D. instead. Think about that. The 2 teenagers were not found because investigators had successfully traced their disappearance to the river. They were found because authorities were searching for somebody else. A different case. A different set of victims. A different national story. And for a moment, the search for one tragedy uncovered another. The discovery should have changed everything. Instead, it became another piece of a much larger investigation. That is one reason the Moore and D. case remains so haunting. Their deaths were not unknown. Their bodies were recovered. Suspects were identified. An investigation occurred. Arrests followed. Yet justice still slipped away. The original state prosecution collapsed. The years passed. And the men accused of participating in the crime were not brought to lasting judgment. This is where the phrase cold case becomes almost misleading. The case was never truly cold. It was alive inside government files. Alive in the memories of witnesses. Alive in the families of the victims. Alive in the records of investigators who had refused to forget. The FBI itself later described the reopening of the investigation as a result of determining that Moore and D. had been kidnapped, taken to the Homachito National Forest, and then driven across state lines into Louisiana. That interstate movement became central to the federal prosecution. And that detail changes the way the crime can be understood. The teenagers were not simply victims of a random attack. According to the evidence presented at trial, their movement from Mississippi into Louisiana formed part of a deliberate sequence. The men who took them did not stop after the initial abduction. They continued. They drove. They crossed a state line. And eventually, the teenagers were taken to the Mississippi River. The journey was not accidental. It had direction. It had purpose. And it ended in death. The Fifth Circuit later summarized the evidence presented at trial as showing that Seal and other Klansmen abducted Moore and D, took them to the Homachito National Forest, beat and interrogated them, and then transported them toward the river after passing through Louisiana. That description is cold, clinical, legal. But behind every word is something terrifying. Abducted. 2 19-year-olds taken against their will. Interrogated. Young men questioned at gunpoint. Beaten. Physical violence used to force answers. Transported. Moved from one location to another. Murdered. A word that cannot capture the finality of what happened. The men who carried out the crime were making decisions. The teenagers were losing choices. That imbalance is at the center of the case. One side had weapons. The other side had nowhere to go. And when the young men could no longer control where they were taken, they could no longer control what happened next. The river became the final destination. Then came the decades. And perhaps the most extraordinary part of the investigation is what happened to the people connected to it during those decades. They lived. They worked. They raised families. They watched television. They celebrated holidays. They went to funerals. They became grandparents. The country changed around them. But somewhere in the background was May 2, 1964. A date that refused to disappear. For the victims' families, every passing year carried the same cruel arithmetic. Charles would have been 20. Then 25. Then 30. Then 40. Then 50. Then 60. But he never became any of those ages. Henry never did either. They remained 19. The photographs preserved them at the beginning of adulthood. The people who loved them grew old without them. That is one of the cruelest effects of murder. The victim stops aging. Everyone else continues. And when the case was finally prosecuted, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The defendant had experienced more than 4 decades of life that the victims never received. The courtroom therefore became more than a place where evidence was presented. It became a place where time itself was measured. 43 years. That was the distance between the crime and the conviction. 43 years between the moment 2 teenagers were taken and the moment a federal jury declared one of their alleged kidnappers guilty. It was long enough for an entire generation to be born and grow up. Long enough for the United States to transform politically and technologically. Long enough for the civil rights era to become history taught in classrooms. Yet the case was still there. Waiting. The federal government had not forgotten. The FBI had not forgotten. And neither had the families. The Fifth Circuit's later review also examined evidence concerning Seal's alleged statements after his 1964 arrest. According to the court record, investigators confronted him with allegations that he and others had taken Moore and D into a remote area, beaten them, and disposed of their bodies in the Mississippi River. The court later ruled on the admissibility and significance of that evidence as part of the appellate process. That detail is especially chilling because the statement came almost immediately after the original arrests. The case was not born in 2007. It was already there in 1964. The information existed. The accusations existed. The arrests existed. The problem was what happened afterward. The case demonstrates a painful reality of historical investigations. Sometimes the question is not whether investigators knew. Sometimes the question is why knowing was not enough. Why did the first prosecution fail? Why did the case remain dormant for so long? Why did decades have to pass before federal prosecutors returned to the evidence? Those questions belong not only to one defendant. They belong to the institutions that handled the case. They belong to the era. They belong to a country struggling with its own history. And they belong to anyone who believes justice should not depend on how long the victims can wait. Because Charles Moore and Henry D. could not wait. They were dead. Their families waited for them. The law waited. The evidence waited. And eventually history waited too. Then, more than 4 decades later, the door opened again. The FBI returned to the case. Prosecutors returned to the evidence. Investigators returned to the names. And suddenly, the past was no longer safely buried. That is what makes cold cases so dangerous for those who believe time will protect them. A forgotten file can be reopened. A witness can speak. A document can surface. A prosecutor can look at an old statute and see a new path. And a crime that seemed untouchable can suddenly become the center of a courtroom. The Moore and D case proved that. But it also proved something darker. Justice can be delayed for so long that the people who deserve to see it may never live long enough to witness it. That is the tragedy hidden behind the celebration of a conviction. The verdict was real. The sentence was real. The accountability was real. But so was the lost time. Nothing could return the years. Nothing could restore the families to May 1, 1964, before everything changed. Nothing could place Charles and Henry back on that road. Nothing could warn them. Nothing could make the car that stopped that afternoon drive past them instead. That moment was gone forever. Only the consequences remained. And those consequences stretched across generations. Today, the story of Charles Moore and Henry D. stands as a warning against one of the most dangerous illusions in criminal justice. The illusion that time makes a crime disappear. It does not. Time changes the evidence. Time changes the witnesses. Time changes the investigators. Time changes the defendant. But it does not change the fact that the crime happened. A 19-year-old was alive. Then he was not. Another 19-year-old was alive. Then he was not. Their families knew. Their communities remembered. And the river carried the physical evidence of what had happened. The passage of decades could not alter those facts. The conviction of James Ford Seal did not solve every historical question surrounding the case. It did something more precise. It established accountability for one participant. It demonstrated that a federal courtroom could still examine a crime committed in 1964. And it forced the country to confront the uncomfortable truth that some of the worst crimes of the civil rights era had never truly disappeared. They had simply been waiting. Waiting for investigators to return. Waiting for witnesses to speak. Waiting for a legal path. Waiting for someone to say that 40 years was not too long. That 50 years was not too long. That history was not finished. And perhaps that is the final image that should remain. Not the courtroom. Not the defendant. Not even the river. But 2 young men whose lives were interrupted before they could become anything else. Charles Moore. Henry D. 19 years old. 2 names that once nearly vanished beneath the noise of a turbulent era. 2 families who carried the loss long after newspapers stopped printing their names. 2 victims whose case traveled from a Mississippi road to a forest, from a river to an FBI file, from an abandoned prosecution to a federal indictment, and finally into a courtroom more than 4 decades later. The distance was enormous. The passage of time was brutal. But the truth survived. And when it finally emerged, it carried with it the memory of 2 teenagers who should have been forgotten only by the calendar. never by history, never by their families, and never by the law. More than 50 years later, the FBI reopens the case of two missing teenagers. Continuation. There is another reason the Moran D case continues to resist being reduced to a simple headline. The crime was committed in a place where geography itself seemed designed to hide secrets. Rural Mississippi in 1964 was not the Mississippi of today. Roads were quieter, communities were smaller, communication was slower. A person could disappear from one county and become almost impossible to trace within hours. There were no mobile phones sending location data, no digital cameras recording passing vehicles, no automated license plate readers, no social media posts documenting where someone had been. Investigators had paper. They had interviews. They had physical evidence. And they had people. That meant the success of an investigation depended heavily on whether those people were willing to speak. In the Moran D case, that willingness was complicated by fear. The Ku Klux Klan was not a ghost from some distant past. It was an active organization. Its members knew one another. They knew where people lived. They knew who attended meetings. They knew who supported the civil rights movement. And they understood the power of intimidation. A witness did not have to be explicitly threatened to understand the danger. Sometimes a reputation was enough. Sometimes a burned cross was enough. Sometimes a whispered warning was enough. And sometimes the simple knowledge that the people being investigated had friends, weapons, and influence was enough to make silence seem safer than truth. That atmosphere shaped the investigation from the beginning. The FBI could collect information. But information is not the same thing as testimony. A report can say that someone heard something. A witness has to stand in a courtroom and say it again. That difference can destroy an old prosecution. Memories can be attacked. Statements can be contradicted. Witnesses can disappear. And when decades pass, every weakness becomes larger. The Moran D case survived those obstacles long enough to reach federal court, but only after years of uncertainty. That alone tells us something about the strength of the evidence eventually assembled. It also tells us something about the persistence of those who refused to let the case die. One of the most important figures in that renewed effort was Thomas More. He was not a federal agent. He was not a prosecutor. He was a brother. And sometimes that is enough to keep a case alive. Thomas did not have the authority to reopen federal investigations. He could not issue subpoenas. He could not interrogate suspects. He could not order forensic tests. But he could ask questions. He could tell the story. He could refuse to accept that his brother's death belonged only to the past. When filmmaker David Ridgen began investigating the case, Thomas became a central figure in bringing the story back into public consciousness. The result was not merely a documentary investigation. It was an emotional confrontation with history. Thomas had spent decades carrying the knowledge that his brother had been murdered. Now someone else was willing to walk with him into the places where the story had begun. That mattered. Because historical crimes often need more than prosecutors. They need people willing to remember. The camera became a witness. Old photographs became witnesses. Family memories became witnesses. And forgotten documents became witnesses. The investigation slowly rebuilt a story that had once been fragmented. The teenagers. The Klan. The interrogation. The forest. The drive. The river. The arrest. The abandoned prosecution. The decades of silence. And eventually the federal courtroom. Every piece mattered. But perhaps the most important discovery was not a physical object. It was the realization that the case still had a living connection to the present. James Fortseal was alive. That fact changed everything. A suspect who had once existed only in old records could now be located. A man connected to events from 1964 was still capable of being brought before a judge. That does not happen often. Most cold cases involving crimes from the 1960s end differently. The suspects die. The witnesses die. The evidence disappears. The legal possibility closes. The story becomes history. But here, one of the men implicated in the original investigation was still alive. And suddenly the question was no longer whether the government could investigate the past. It was whether the government would. The FBI reopened its investigation. Federal prosecutors examined the evidence. And the case began moving toward indictment. For the families, this must have been almost surreal. For decades, justice had seemed impossible. Then suddenly there were investigators again. There were interviews. There were prosecutors. There were legal filings. There was an arrest. The past was moving. But with movement came danger. Every old case carries the possibility that renewed attention will produce disappointment. What if witnesses could no longer remember? What if evidence was legally unusable? What if the statute of limitations prevented prosecution? What if the jury did not believe the testimony? What if, after all those years, the case collapsed again? Those questions hung over the investigation. The government could not afford to treat history as emotion. It needed evidence. It needed a legal theory. It needed proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And that is where the federal kidnapping charge became critical. The prosecution was not simply trying to resurrect a state murder case from 1964. It was building a federal case around the kidnapping and interstate transportation of the victims. The teenagers had been taken from Mississippi. They had been transported into Louisiana. Then they were brought back toward the Mississippi River. That movement created a federal jurisdictional pathway that the government could use decades later. The legal strategy was complex. The emotional story was simple. Two young men had been taken. They did not come home. Their families waited. The government finally returned. The courtroom became the place where those two realities collided. The defense argued that the prosecution was too late. The government argued that federal kidnapping law provided the basis for prosecution. The judges examined the statutes. The lawyers debated history. The jury examined evidence. And eventually the verdict arrived. Guilty. But even after that word was spoken, the case continued to generate questions. What had happened to the other men involved? Why had the first prosecution failed? Why had the case remained dormant for so long? Could other perpetrators ever be identified? Could other cold cases from the same era receive similar attention? These questions matter because the Moore and D case was not an isolated incident. It existed within a broader pattern of racial violence in the American South. The civil rights era produced hundreds of acts of intimidation, assault, bombing, kidnapping, and murder. Some became national scandals. Others remained local tragedies. Some were investigated immediately. Others barely entered official records. Some suspects were arrested. Others lived out their lives without ever entering a courtroom. That is why reopening historical cases is so important. Each case can reveal something about the larger system. The individual crime is one piece. The surrounding silence is another. And sometimes the silence tells us as much as the crime itself. Why did people remain quiet? Why did communities protect certain individuals? Why were victims dismissed? Why were some investigations abandoned? Why did justice depend so heavily on the political climate of the moment? Those questions are uncomfortable because they move beyond individual guilt. They ask whether institutions failed. And if they failed, why? The Moore and D case cannot answer every one of those questions. But it provides a devastating example of what can happen when violence is combined with intimidation and institutional weakness. The teenagers were not simply killed. Their deaths were followed by decades in which the legal system did not provide the accountability their families deserved. That second wound matters. The first wound was murder. The second was delay. The third was silence. And sometimes the third wound can be almost as painful as the first. Families are forced to live without answers. They hear rumors. They see suspects remain free. They watch the news report other cases being solved. They wonder why their loved ones did not receive the same attention. And eventually, some begin to wonder whether anyone remembers. Thomas More refused to let that happen. He kept the name alive. He kept Charles alive in conversation. And through that persistence, the case reached a new generation. That is one of the most important lessons hidden inside the investigation. Cold cases are sometimes solved because technology improves. But sometimes they move because someone refuses to stop caring. The FBI can reopen a file. A prosecutor can build a case. A journalist can uncover a lead. A filmmaker can tell the story. But at the center is often a family member who simply refuses to accept that the victim has become irrelevant. That refusal can last decades. And it can become the bridge between memory and justice. The Moore and D case also demonstrates the importance of historical documentation. Without the original FBI files, the old arrests, the statements, and the records from 1964, prosecutors decades later would have had almost nothing to work with. Historical evidence is fragile. Paper burns. Buildings disappear. Files are misplaced.
Witnesses die.
But when records survive, they can become time capsules. A report written in 1964 can suddenly become critical in 2007. A statement taken by an investigator who has been dead for years can suddenly matter to a new prosecutor. A name typed on an old page can become the starting point for a new investigation. That is why cold case work is often less dramatic than movies suggest. It is not always about discovering a hidden fingerprint. It can be about reading thousands of pages, comparing dates, checking names, finding contradictions, locating witnesses, understanding the context in which an old statement was made. Then asking one question again. Does this evidence still matter? In the Moore and D investigation, the answer was yes. Old evidence still mattered. Old witnesses still mattered. Old crimes still mattered. And the victims still mattered. The passage of time did not erase them. It only made the work harder. There is something almost paradoxical about the way the case moved through history. The crime was committed in a world where information traveled slowly. The reopened investigation took place in a world where information could travel instantly. Yet the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. What happened? Who was responsible? Can it be proved? And can justice still be done? Those questions have existed since the beginning of criminal law. Technology changes. Politics changes. Society changes. But the questions remain. The Moore and D case therefore belongs to two different eras at once. It is a story from 1964. And it is a story from the 21st century. It begins with a rural road and ends in a federal courtroom. Between those places lies the history of the United States itself. Segregation. Civil rights. Federal intervention. Political change. Cultural change. And the slow realization that crimes committed in the name of racial hatred could not simply be buried beneath the passage of time. The teenagers were caught inside that history. They never asked to become symbols. They never volunteered to become names in FBI archives. They were simply two young men. And that may be the most important thing to remember. Before they were victims, they were people. Before they were case numbers, they were sons. Before they were historical figures, they were 19-year-olds with ordinary lives. The crime transformed them into symbols. But their families never stopped seeing the people. That is why the photographs matter. The young faces. The ordinary expressions. The clothing. The hairstyles. The eyes. They remind us that history is not made of dates alone. It is made of people. People who laugh. People who worry. People who make plans. People who expect tomorrow to arrive. Charles and Henry expected tomorrow. They never got it. And when the investigation finally returned more than 40 years later, it was not because the world suddenly discovered that their lives mattered. Their lives had always mattered. The world had simply failed to act like it. The federal prosecution could not undo that failure. But it could acknowledge it. It could place the weight of law behind the names. It could force a courtroom to listen. And it could ensure that the story did not disappear completely. That is what remains after the headlines fade. Not the shock of an arrest. Not the drama of a trial. But memory. 2 19-year-olds. A Mississippi road. A vehicle that stopped. A disappearance. A river. For decades of silence. Then the FBI returned. And when the old case finally opened again, the question was no longer whether anyone remembered Charles Moore and Henry D. The question was whether the country was finally ready to remember them honestly. The answer came slowly. Painfully. But it came. And the names remained. More than 50 years later, the FBI reopens the case of 2 missing teenagers. Continuation. The deeper investigators looked into the history surrounding Charles Moore and Henry D., the more difficult it became to separate the murders from the world that produced them. This was not simply a story about 2 teenagers who crossed paths with the wrong men. It was a story about a system of fear that had been operating long before May 2, 1964, and about how that system could make violence appear normal to the people committing it. In Mississippi, racial terror did not always announce itself with a headline. Sometimes it appeared as a warning. Sometimes as a threat. Sometimes as a meeting behind a closed door. Sometimes as a man watching from across the street. And sometimes it arrived in a vehicle and offered a ride. For Charles Moore and Henry D., that ride became the beginning of the end. The tragedy is that neither teenager could have known what was waiting for them. They were not walking into an obvious trap. There was no sign telling them to run. There was no reason to believe that accepting transportation would become a death sentence. Ordinary decisions can become irreversible in an instant. That is what makes cases like this so haunting. The victims are not necessarily doing anything extraordinary when their lives end. They are simply living. And then somebody else decides that their life no longer matters. The investigation eventually established that the men who took Moore and D. believed the teenagers were connected to weapons and possible black resistance activity. That belief was central to the violence that followed. It did not matter that suspicion was not proof. It did not matter that the teenagers were entitled to the same protection under the law as anyone else. The men who seized them had already decided that they were dangerous. Once that decision had been made, everything that followed became easier to justify in their minds. Interrogation. Threats. Beatings. Transportation. Death. That is one of the most frightening characteristics of extremist violence. The victim does not have to commit a crime. The victim only has to be labeled an enemy. And in 1964 Mississippi, the label could be enough. The Klan operated through ideology, secrecy, and intimidation. Its members did not need everyone in the community to participate. They needed enough people to fear them. That fear created silence. Silence created uncertainty. Uncertainty created opportunities for criminals. And opportunities created more victims. The disappearance of Moore and D. therefore cannot be understood without understanding the atmosphere surrounding them. This was the year of Freedom Summer. Civil rights workers were arriving in Mississippi. Black communities were organizing. Voting rights were being challenged. National attention was turning toward the South, and resistance to that change was becoming increasingly violent. The teenagers were caught in the middle. They did not have to be famous activists. They did not have to be leaders. They simply had to be perceived as part of a world that white supremacists believed was threatening their power. That perception became deadly. The later federal investigation did something the original investigation had struggled to accomplish. It placed the crime into a larger chain of evidence. The names of individuals, the movements of vehicles, the statements of witnesses, the history of the suspects, the circumstances of the abduction, the route through Mississippi and Louisiana, the location of the bodies. None of these details alone could recreate the entire crime. Together, they formed a narrative that prosecutors could present to a jury. And that is how old investigations often work. Not through one spectacular discovery. Through accumulation. One fact. Then another. Then another. Until the silence begins to look less like uncertainty and more like concealment. The passage of time can actually make this process more complicated. People remember events differently. Some memories become stronger. Others become distorted. A witness may remember the face but forget the date. Another may remember the date but confuse the location. A third may remember something that seemed meaningless in 1964, but becomes important decades later. Investigators therefore have to distinguish between memory and evidence. They have to ask what can be independently confirmed. They have to compare statements. They have to identify inconsistencies without automatically assuming that every inconsistency means deception. Human memory is imperfect. Historical investigation must account for that imperfection. In the Moore and D case, prosecutors ultimately persuaded jurors that the evidence was sufficient to convict Seal. But the path to that courtroom had been extraordinarily long. And the length of that path raises another question. What happens to justice when everyone involved has changed? The investigators are different. The prosecutors are different. The witnesses are different. The defendant is different. The victims remain the same. That imbalance is impossible to escape. Charles and Henry never had the opportunity to change. They never had the opportunity to regret something they had done. They never had the opportunity to become fathers. They never had the opportunity to watch their communities change. They never had the opportunity to see segregation weaken. They never had the opportunity to witness the election of black political leaders. They never had the opportunity to see the country enter a new century. Their lives stopped in 1964. The rest of America kept moving. That contrast gives the case an almost unbearable quality. The teenagers were frozen in time while the country that had failed to protect them transformed around their absence. Then, decades later, the country looked backward. And what it saw was not a forgotten tragedy. It saw unfinished business. The federal investigation became part of a broader effort to address crimes committed during the civil rights era. Those investigations carried a unique burden. They were not simply seeking convictions. They were attempting to reconstruct historical truth. That distinction matters. A prosecution asks whether the evidence proves a defendant committed a specific crime. History asks what happened, why it happened, who knew, who remained silent, and what the consequences were. A courtroom can answer only some of those questions. The Moore and D case therefore remained larger than the conviction. The verdict established accountability. But it could not explain every decision made by every person involved. It could not identify every silent witness. It could not restore every missing document. And it could not determine how different the lives of Charles and Henry might have been if they had survived. Those possibilities are unknowable. And that is perhaps the deepest tragedy of murder. The future disappears with the victim. We can calculate what someone might have earned. We can imagine what career they might have chosen. We can look at family photographs and speculate about the person they might have become. But we can never know. Because the future is not evidence. It is possibility. And murder destroys possibility. Charles Moore was 19. Henry D. was 19. At that age, almost everything remains unwritten. Person can change careers. Move to another state. Fall in love. Make mistakes. Start again. Build a family. Become someone entirely different from the person they were at 19. Charles and Henry were denied all of it. The people responsible did not merely take their lives. They took every unwritten chapter. That is why the case continues to resonate. It is not only about the past. It is about the futures that never existed. There is another layer to the story. The bodies of Moore and Dee were discovered during the search for Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. That coincidence placed their deaths inside one of the most famous criminal investigations of the civil rights era. But it also created an uncomfortable hierarchy of memory. The three civil rights workers became internationally recognized symbols. Moore and Dee remained less well known. Their story had to fight for space inside a historical narrative already dominated by other names. That does not diminish the importance of Cheney, Goodman, or Schwerner. Their murders were horrific. But it does reveal something about how history is remembered. Some victims become symbols. Others become footnotes. Some cases receive documentaries, books, memorials, and national attention. Others survive only because one family member refuses to stop asking questions. Charles and Henry were in danger of becoming the second kind. The renewed investigation changed that. It brought their names back into public discussion. It allowed journalists and filmmakers to examine their lives. It allowed historians to place their murders into the broader context of Mississippi's civil rights struggle. And it gave their families something that cannot be measured in legal terms. Recognition. Recognition does not replace justice. But it matters. To have the world acknowledge that your loved one existed matters. To have people say their name matters. To have their photograph displayed matters. To have the circumstances of their death investigated matters. Because the opposite of remembrance is not always hatred. Sometimes it is indifference. And indifference can be devastating. The families of Charles and Henry did not need the world to turn their loved ones into legends. They needed the world to understand that they were human beings. That they mattered. That what happened to them mattered. And that the people responsible should not be protected simply because decades had passed. The federal conviction sent precisely that message. But it also demonstrated the limits of the law. The justice system can punish a defendant. It cannot punish history. Cannot imprison an era. Cannot sentence a culture. It can only address the individual criminal responsibility supported by evidence. That leaves a larger question hanging over the case. What would justice have looked like in 1964? If the original prosecution had succeeded, perhaps Charles's family would have received answers while they were still young. Perhaps Henry's family would have watched the perpetrators go to prison. Perhaps witnesses would have felt safer speaking. Perhaps the case would have become an early warning about the consequences of racial violence. Perhaps other crimes might have been investigated differently. But those possibilities belong to an alternate history. The actual history is harsher. The prosecution failed. The suspects remained outside prison. The families waited. The country moved forward. And the truth had to travel through decades before reaching a jury. That delay is part of the crime's legacy. Because justice delayed does not merely inconvenience the victim's family. It changes the meaning of justice itself. When a defendant is convicted 43 years later, the sentence is no longer only punishment. It becomes historical acknowledgement. A statement that the crime still matters. A statement that the victim's death still counts. A statement that the passage of time did not make the act acceptable. And that may be why the Moran D case remains so powerful. It demonstrates that the legal system can sometimes reach backward. But it also reminds us how difficult that journey becomes when institutions wait too long. The evidence may survive. The truth may survive. But the people do not.
Witnesses die.
Victims' parents die. Siblings grow old. The people who most wanted to see justice may never live long enough to witness it. That is the cruelest consequence of delay.
Justice quand arrive.
And still arrive too late. For Charles and Henry, there was no later chapter. For their families, there was. And that chapter was filled with waiting. Waiting became part of their lives. Then waiting became memory. Then memory became history. And finally, history became evidence. That transformation is what makes this case so unusual. A family memory can become an investigative lead. An old photograph can become a historical record. A newspaper article can become a clue. A forgotten FBI report can become relevant again. A witness who once remained silent can eventually speak. And a case that once seemed dead can begin moving. That is what happened here. The investigation did not defeat time. It used what remained after time had done its damage. And what remained was enough. Enough to reopen the case. Enough to bring a defendant before a jury. Enough to produce a conviction. Enough to ensure that the names Charles Moore and Henry D. would not disappear completely. But there is one final truth that no investigation can change. The most important evidence in the case was also the simplest. Two young men were alive. Then they were gone. Their families waited. Their bodies were found. The government investigated. The original prosecution failed. Decades passed. The case was reopened. A conviction followed. That sequence is now part of the historical record. But behind every date is a person. Behind every document is a family. Behind every courtroom argument is a life that cannot be restored. And behind every cold case is the same question. If the victim could speak today, what would they ask? Perhaps Charles would ask why nobody came sooner. Perhaps Henry would ask why the men who took them were allowed to live freely for so many years. Perhaps neither would ask anything at all. Perhaps they would simply want to go home. That is the image that remains when everything else is stripped away. Not the politics. Not the courtroom. Not the legal arguments. Home. Two 19-year-olds who should have returned home that day. They never did. More than 4 decades later, the FBI and federal prosecutors reconstructed enough of their final journey to hold one participant accountable. But accountability is not resurrection. A verdict cannot reopen the future. A sentence cannot reverse the river. A courtroom cannot make 19 disappear and 20 appear. What it can do is refuse to let the crime be rewritten. It can preserve the truth. It can give the victims their names back. And sometimes, after decades of silence, that is where justice begins. Not with the return of the dead, but with the refusal to forget them. Charles Moore. Henry D. 19 years old. Taken from an ordinary road in Mississippi. Their story disappeared for decades beneath fear, violence, and silence. Then the files reopened. The witnesses spoke. The evidence was examined again. The courtroom listened. And the past, after all those years, finally answered. More than 50 years later, the FBI reopens the case of 2 missing teenagers. Continuation. But the past had one more lesson to teach, and it was not contained in the verdict. It was contained in everything that happened before the verdict. The years of silence. The abandoned prosecution. The witnesses who carried memories into old age. The families who kept photographs when almost everything else had changed. the investigators who eventually returned to files written by men who had been dead for decades, and the realization that a case can remain alive even when nobody is talking about it. For Charles Moore and Henry D., the first investigation had never truly disappeared. It had simply become quieter. The names remained inside records. The photographs remained in family collections. The river remained where it had always been. And somewhere in Mississippi, the places connected to the crime continued to exist, even as the people who remembered them became fewer. That is one of the strangest realities of historical crime. The landscape survives longer than the witnesses. A road can remain after everyone who traveled it is gone. A forest can remain after everyone who entered it has died. A river can continue flowing after generations have forgotten what was thrown into it. The physical world remembers nothing. But investigators can make it remember. They can return to locations. They can reconstruct routes. They can compare old maps with modern geography. They can examine where vehicles could have traveled and how long those journeys might have taken. And when those details are combined with testimony, a timeline begins to emerge. The Moore and D investigation depended heavily on that reconstruction. The teenagers were taken. They were driven away. They were questioned. They were beaten. They were moved across state lines. And eventually they were taken to the river. Every movement mattered because every movement narrowed the possibilities. The case was no longer a mystery in the traditional sense. It was a reconstruction. Investigators were trying to rebuild a sequence that had been deliberately hidden. That is what perpetrators often depend upon. Confusion. If there are enough locations, enough people, enough stories, enough years, the truth can become buried beneath contradictions. But investigators work in the opposite direction. They simplify. They compare. They eliminate. They ask what could have happened. Then they ask what could not have happened. And slowly the impossible disappears. What remains becomes the story. In 1964, that process was interrupted. In the renewed investigation, it was restarted. And every old document became potentially important. The FBI had accumulated enormous quantities of information during the civil rights era. Agents interviewed people, tracked suspects, recorded allegations, and documented the activities of extremist organizations. Some reports were routine. Others were highly significant. Many were written quickly, under pressure, by investigators who could not have known that decades later someone might read their words searching for a forgotten connection. That is why old case files can be so powerful. They contain the assumptions of their time. They contain the limitations of their time. But they also contain details. A name. A location. A meeting. A vehicle. A statement. Something that seemed ordinary in 1964 can become extraordinary when examined from the perspective of 2007. The passage of time changes the questions investigators ask. In 1964, the immediate question was where the missing teenagers had gone. Decades later, investigators could ask something different. What did we already know? Who had we already interviewed? What did witnesses say? Which suspects were named? Which statements were ignored? Which leads were abandoned? The old investigation became a map. And the renewed investigation followed that map. That is one reason the story of Charles and Henry is also a story about institutional memory. A criminal investigation is not only the work of the people currently holding badges. It is cumulative. One generation of investigators leaves records for another. One prosecutor creates a file that another prosecutor may eventually reopen. One witness makes a statement that may become important long after the witness is gone. When that chain breaks, cases disappear. When it survives, justice remains possible. In the Moore and D case, enough of the chain survived. That does not mean the original investigation was perfect. It was not. It does not mean every person involved was held accountable. They were not. It does not mean every mystery surrounding the murders was resolved. It was not. But the surviving evidence was enough to reopen the case and eventually secure a conviction. That alone is extraordinary. Because the odds were against it. The victims were dead. The original witnesses were elderly. The defendant was elderly. The crime had occurred before modern forensic technology. And the country had moved through decades of political and social transformation. Yet the case survived all of that. There is another reason the investigation matters. It shows how the definition of justice can change over time. In 1964, justice would have meant immediate prosecution, a conviction, a sentence, a clear public acknowledgement of what had happened. In 2007, justice looked different. It meant reconstructing history, finding a surviving defendant, using federal law to reach a crime that had escaped state prosecution, and proving to a modern jury that the evidence from the distant past was still trustworthy. The result could never be identical to what justice in 1964 would have meant. Too much had been lost. Too many people had died. Too much time had passed. But the later prosecution still carried significance. It told the families that the government was willing to say, publicly and formally, that what happened to their loved ones had been a crime. That statement has enormous weight. Because silence can make a crime feel invisible. A conviction makes it permanent. It becomes part of the official record. Future generations can look back and know that the victims were not forgotten. They can learn the names. They can understand the circumstances. They can see the failure and the eventual response. And perhaps that is one of the most important consequences of solving historical crimes. They teach the future what the past tried to hide. The Moore D case also forces a difficult examination of the word suspect. In ordinary conversation, a suspect is someone who may have committed a crime. In a historical investigation, that word can remain attached to a person for decades. But legal guilt is different. The federal trial had to distinguish between rumor and evidence, between association and participation, between what people believed and what prosecutors could prove. That distinction is essential. The story is powerful precisely because the final judgment was made through a legal process rather than through historical accusation alone. A jury heard evidence. The defense challenged it. The prosecution defended it. The court considered the law. And a conviction followed. That is how a cold case becomes part of the criminal justice system, rather than remaining only a story. But the process also exposes another painful reality. For many families, legal standards can feel unbearably distant from emotional truth. A family may know what happened. Community may know what happened. But knowing is not enough. The law demands proof. And proof can disappear. That is why the original failure matters. The case had information in 1964. But information without a successful prosecution leaves victims in a terrible position. Their loved one's death becomes officially unresolved, even when people privately believe they know who was responsible. That gap between public truth and legal truth can last for generations. The Moore D case lived inside that gap for more than 40 years. Then the gap began to close. Not completely, but enough. The reopened investigation also demonstrated the importance of persistence from outside the traditional law enforcement structure. Journalists, historians, filmmakers, and family members can uncover stories that institutions have stopped actively pursuing. They can ask questions that official investigators no longer have resources to ask. They can locate people. They can compare records. They can remind the public that the case exists. That attention can create pressure. And pressure can lead to action. In the Moore D story, public attention helped revive a case that had been nearly forgotten by the broader public. The documentary work surrounding the case gave Thomas More an opportunity to tell his brother's story to people who had never heard it. That matters because memory needs an audience. Person can remember alone. But when the story is shared, memory becomes history. And history can create accountability. The renewed attention also challenged a dangerous assumption. That old crimes belong only to old people. They do not. The consequences continue. The children of victims inherit stories. The grandchildren inherit photographs. Communities inherit scars. And future generations inherit the responsibility to understand what happened. Charles and Henry died in 1964. But their story continued into the 21st century. That means their deaths were not confined to the era in which they occurred. The impact crossed generations. The same is true of the civil rights movement itself. The legal changes of the 1960s did not erase the violence that came before them. The passage of civil rights legislation did not automatically solve every murder. It did not bring every victim home. It did not make every witness speak. And it did not put every perpetrator behind bars. Some cases remained unfinished. The Moore and D case was one of those unfinished stories. Until it wasn't. That transformation is the heart of the investigation. For decades, the case represented failure. Then it became evidence that failure was not necessarily permanent. The difference came from people who refused to accept the first ending. They looked again. They asked again. They investigated again. And eventually the legal system responded. There is a temptation when telling stories like this to focus only on the dramatic moments. The arrest. The indictment. The courtroom. The verdict. But the real work happened between those moments. Research. Interviews. Records. Verification. Legal analysis. Persistence. Thousands of small actions that rarely make headlines. That is how old cases move. Not like lightning. Like pressure. Slowly building until something finally breaks. In the Moore and D case, what broke was the wall of silence that had protected the past. Once the case was reopened, the old story could no longer remain comfortably buried. The defendant had to answer questions. Witnesses had to revisit memories. Prosecutors had to explain the evidence. And the public had to confront a history that was easier to ignore when the victims were only names in old documents. That is the power of reopening a cold case. It forces the present to meet the past. The present says, that was a long time ago. The evidence answers, but it happened. The present says, the witnesses are old. The evidence answers, but they remember. The present says, the defendant is elderly. The evidence answers, the victim was 19. That final contrast is impossible to escape. The man accused of participating in the crime had decades. The teenagers did not. One life continued. 2 lives stopped. And the difference between those outcomes was not an accident. It was the consequence of a decision made on a road in Mississippi. That is why the case cannot be reduced to an old murder. It is a story about choice. The choice to abduct. The choice to use violence. The choice to remain silent. The choice to investigate. The choice to reopen. And finally, the choice of a jury to convict based on the evidence presented. Every generation made its own choices. The first generation created the tragedy. The next generation inherited the silence. The next generation reopened the questions. And the next generation will inherit the memory. That is how historical justice works. It moves through time. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes painfully. But it moves. And perhaps the most important thing the Moore and D case leaves behind is not a warning about the past. It is a warning about the present. A crime does not become less important because the victim is poor. It does not become less important because the victim is unknown. It does not become less important because the newspapers have moved on. And it does not become less important because the suspect has grown old. Justice cannot depend on the attention span of the public. If it does, some victims will always be forgotten. Charles Moore and Henry D. came close to being forgotten. But they were not. Their names survived. Their families survived. The records survived. And eventually the investigation survived. The river could not keep them hidden forever. The decades could not keep them silent forever. And the old files could not remain unopened forever. More than 40 years after the teenagers vanished, the past finally returned to the present. Not as a ghost. Not as a rumor. As evidence. As testimony. As a federal case. And as a verdict. But even then, the final lesson remained painfully simple. There are no true endings in a murder case. There are only moments when the questions become fewer. Charles Moore and Henry D. can never tell us what they saw after that ride began. They cannot identify every person who knew. They cannot describe their final moments. They cannot explain what they were thinking. They cannot tell their families what they would have become. Their voices were taken from them in 1964. So everyone who tells their story now carries a responsibility. Do not turn them into statistics. Do not reduce them to symbols. Do not allow the violence that killed them to become more memorable than the lives they lived. Remember that before the headlines, before the FBI files, before the courtroom, they were simply Charles and Henry. 19 years old. Young. Alive. And expecting to see another morning. They never did. But their story did. And after more than 4 decades of silence, it finally reached a place where the past could no longer pretend that nothing had happened.